Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to session 2 here. I'm just going to give people, well, I'll give people a few seconds. Andrew, I'm sure as soon as they hear you start talking, people are going to be flocking back into the room. It's going to be a natural
experiment. The people at home can't see the crowds coming in because they're hearing my voice.
So, welcome to the second panel. We're going to follow up the health insurance panel with a discussion of employment trends, quality, and type. And this is a really interesting panel because it takes us beyond the question of, just how many people are employed, sort of that 0-1 binary indicator of are you employed, and gets really at different elements of job quality. And the panel session today is going to has 3 panelists. Andrew Houtenville is going to talk about long-term employment trends. So are people staying in the labor force more than a single period? Nathan Moon and Francis Harris will talk about the contingent employment of people with disabilities. And then Meghan Henley will talk about job quality, tying it all together. And this work really matters because one of my favorite quotes from a colleague was Rich Luking. And Rich Luking once said, "Work is good." It's a simple statement, but it very much is a true statement. And as everybody thinks about why they're here today, people are here at work. And that work develops multiple different aspects of your life, whether it be from health, whether it be from social connections, whether it be from all other aspects of your well-being. So looking at these different aspects of employment is going to be really, really important. And so with that summary, let me turn it over to you, Andrew, to talk about what are the long-term employment trends of people with disabilities.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. This is work that I've been doing over the last few years, and increasingly over the summer with a graduate student at the University of New Hampshire Economics PhD program, Bryce Stanley, who can't be here today because he's actually teaching my course right this very minute. And actually he's teaching the students how to do some of the data extraction work that underlie this work. We're shooting to have a paper ready by the end of the semester. This work may end up being a chapter in Bryce's dissertation. We're not sure quite yet. So let me kind of, similar to what Jody did when she talked about the trends in insurance, and then Purvi and Jay, if he was here, would have gone on to talk about the impact of a program on insurance and employment and things like that. I'm going to give kind of the overall lay of the land, and then the others will talk about quality and different aspects of employment. So this is what we've been tracking. Some of you may be familiar with our end-tide. The gray is not. Oh, it's on the screen. Oh, good, it's on the screen. It's not on here. The gray is the Great Recession, which is defined by economic growth, changes in GDP, and then full employment, which is defined, both are defined by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and full employment is typically around below 4%. It varies a little bit depending on the author. And so this is the end-tide result, and what you see is we're actually seeing, this is the employment of people with disabilities. What you're seeing is actually an unprecedented growth in the employment of people with disabilities. Rich Berghauser and I did many years, did research on the employment patterns of people, employment trends of people with disabilities. And this last few years, and this is mid-year, it continued to go up for a little bit after this, at the end of 2018. This was really unprecedented, and so much so that Bryce and I are basically trying to investigate, okay, so why is this different, right? If we can figure out why this is different, is there a sector, is there a type of job, and we'll eventually get into not necessarily job quality, although we will look at hours and things like that, and rough salary. Is this different than something else? And so we decided to go back in time, and unfortunately, the ACS and CPS and SIP started to collect data in 2008. The 6-question sequence was adopted by many surveys, HIS and others. So we don't really have measures for the 6 questions, hearing, vision, mobility, cognitive, self-care, and independent living, go outside the home type questions. We don't have that data, so we're going to have to use something else. And this is the same period of time. This is what's called the work limitation variable. It has some issues. People may stop reporting work limitation because of loss of job. There's not a lot of evidence to that effect, but you can see, if I can get it to go backwards. I'm flicking back and, oh, no. What you can see is a similar pattern, a decline and then an increase. There was a change in the survey design such that there's like a discontinuity there that is probably attributed to survey effect. We also have, and this is going to go in the opposite direction, the monthly initial disability applications per weekday in thousands. And so we saw a rise in the application rate after the Great Recession, after it started to increase during the Great Recession. That was my shoulder talking. And then a decline shortly after that. Some of this could be attributed to changes in the amount of money given to SSA for adjudicating claims. But in terms of like initial application, that would be for award that would affect that. So for initial application, this might represent similar to what we saw in the employment rates. And then we have this other measure. And so there was a Wall Street Journal article that Bryce ran across recently that used these data. And it used the percentage of the labor force that said that they were not in labor force due to a disability. And for years, we've never really used this variable, in part because they make a distinction between out of labor force due to a disability, due to retirement, and due to school, and then all other reasons. And it's kind of it's a coding issue of taking 20-some questions and distilling them down to 7 categories. And I've never been confident in the skip patterns. But it does show the similar trend, right? So again, this is opposite. The percentage of people that are reporting out of the labor market due to disability is rising from the Great Recession. Even before, during kind of the heart of the recession, it was increasing. And then it started to taper down. And the reporter noticed this going down. And so, okay, well, I know that this variable is collected for a lot longer time period. This is one of the prime labor force questions. It's asked to all participants in the CPS every month, right? And so this is monthly data, similar to NTIDE is monthly. And so I can take this even further back. And in fact, Bryce and I worked over the summer, mostly Bryce, to take this back to 1962, right? And so this is the first time a lot of the ADA-related research that Rich and I were involved with went back to 1980. Ed Yellen at University of California, San Francisco did a study that used the HIS back to like 1974, I think. But they have, what they typically have are a lot of discontinuities with regard to survey design, but this is the core set of questions. They've only changed these questions twice, or once. They've only had 2 versions over time, and so what I'm going to do is lay out this period. And so you see the Great Recession is the last gray bar. The green is, the green shading are full employment periods. It is possible to have a recession and have full employment because recessions are based on economic growth, not employment rate numbers. And it takes a while. There's a lag in employment. Firms start losing money, and then they start, dropping employment, dropping people, and then they start potentially reducing wages. So income and employment are lagging. And so they're very different data sources as well, and different concepts. And so it is actually possible to have them at the same time. And so what you see here is a real steady march up. And you see that the current period is really very different. The only other period where you may be able to see a decline is the full employment period the full employment period that started in 2005-06. There's a slight decline, although, and these are monthly, and actually that's the dot for the months. That's how tightly these are packed. And so you really do see that the current period is very unprecedented, right? And so maybe we could learn a lot from this period. And so that's what Bryce and are going to try to do. There were some changes in 2013, so I wanted to meter this out and make this a slow roll to kind of build the excitement. I know Dave is sitting here waiting for this, see what this looks back to the years before he was born, even before I was born. So you guys ready? Here we go. So there's a big jump down from that period, and that reflects design. What you see is basically a steady march upwards. There's a kind of a trough in the early 1980s. There are two recessions. My recessions graph is not working so well because there were recessions in the early 80s. I'll have to fix my recession graph. But right around the 1980s, which is, they're not showing up here, they're showing up here. Oh, good. So you can actually see the Reagan recessions, the real deep one was 1980. You know, think of the air traffic controller strike. That's this time. And then there was a short recession after that. And you really didn't, you saw a decline during, there seems to be a decline in the late 70s, in the 70s and into almost into the 80s. And then you see it declines into the early 80s and then rises thereafter. And so is there something we can learn from the middle 70s? The other thing I'd like to do as we move forward with this research is to look at industries. And so, 5 minutes? 5 minutes, all right. Actually, I'm not going to take that long. And so we're going to try to learn from, that decline in the 70s and into the 80s is pretty slight, right? But maybe there's something to learn to see if similar things happen. So in the 70s, I want to take this not as a percentage of the labor force, but as the percentage of the population. That's something that we've looked at employment to population ratios, and they pretty much show the same thing for most part for the years we have data. But look at it as a percent of the population, because what was coming in 1974 was SSI. So SSI started in 74 and maybe earlier. But it was 74, right? Yeah. And so something might be happening there. So again, the current time period is really unprecedented. Looking at the full employment rates, we've done a lot of initial estimates to see if we can find some effects. I'd also like to take initial application rates back to this point. I can only get back to 2000, but folks at Social Security have said that they could certainly estimate that if I could ever get them to do it for years earlier. So next steps, probably the first step is to look at the composition to make sure that keep age, race, gender the same over time. Look at SSD applicants and recipiency over time, try to go further back, investigate the dynamics of recession and no recovery. One of the things that we were tracking with NTIDE for a long time is there was no recovery. Elaine can talk about how for a long time we were the bearers of bad news. There was no recovery. People without disabilities were recovering, but we weren't seeing a recovery until the last couple years for people with disabilities. So there's perhaps a slow recovery period, and maybe it takes full employment to. And it was a pretty slow recovery period, economic growth-wise and employment-wise, for after the Great Recession. So we also want to look at can we learn anything from the current period? Were there different types of disabilities that were affected than others? What happened to number of hours? Was number of hours also increasing for those who do work? So that's what we're going to do in the next few months. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nathan. Are you splitting this presentation?
We're going to do it together.
Okay.
There is a laser. They told me there's no laser on this thing.
Watch out, you could bear an eye with that.
So that's forward, that's back.
Forward and back, great. Excellent. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nathan Moon,
And I'm Fran Harris.
and we are researchers from the Georgia Institute of Technology, better known as Georgia Tech in Atlanta. And today's presentation is titled Contingent Employment of Individuals with Disabilities. And here today we're going to present some of our findings from our first year of research that is drawing upon qualitative study that we have done to date. Just to begin, simply put, we're becoming a nation of contingent workers. The structure of work has changed over the past several decades, and I would just posit that we all are increasingly becoming a nation of contractors and freelancers, and for some, even micro-entrepreneurs. But you need not need to be a driver for Uber or Lyft to recognize the ways in which our economy is fundamentally changing. So a lot of talk about contingent employment. Well, what is contingent employment? Well, definitions vary, but simply put, generally contingent employment may be seen as two things. It is a lack of attachment between the employer and the worker, as well as a reliance upon a conditional factor for employment, such as you do a job for a fixed limited period of time, or you have a specific job to be done. So there is a prescriptive literature out there on what contingent employment might mean for people with disabilities that suggests that perhaps contingent employment offers new opportunities to counter the high rates of unemployment or underemployment of people with disabilities. I would push back a little to say that, however, that actually the situation is a little more complex, to say the least. On the positive side, contingent employment might allow new opportunities to enter the workforce or create opportunities to counter unemployment or underemployment, yes. And it may offer flexibility that standard employment cannot offer for people with disabilities. However, there are some drawbacks. There is a potential for lower pay and few benefits. The few studies that do exist, most notably a study that was done by the Government Accountability Office several years ago, points to the fact that contingent employment is often correlated with lower pay and fewer benefits for the people who do it. Also, there may not be any provisions for workplace accommodations. It's not clear what, if any, provisions people might get under things such as Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And finally, contingent employment just simply might undermine the long-held goals of full employment for people with disabilities. And the truth is that we know very little. What few studies there are would include Lisa Scher's studies that she carried out in the early 2000s with her colleagues such as Doug Cruz that looked at the reasons for why people with disabilities engage in contingent employment. She threw out three possible explanations. One was to counter discrimination in obtaining employment. One was to limit SSDI, SSI, to limit your hours so that you would not lose these benefits. And finally, the needs for health needs and flexibility that these workers might need. And her studies kind of came to health needs and flexibility as the key drivers. Kennedy and Olney several years later kind of added to that by sort of reinforcing, though, that SSDI was often a major decision and whether or not people would engage in this so that they would not lose these benefits. And then within the last couple of years, there have been a couple of studies that have come out that have looked at crowd workers with disabilities and their participation in the so-called gig economy. Nevertheless, a major research gap remains, and the actual participation experiences of people with disabilities in contingent work remains understudied. Particularly, we know little, if any, about the prevalence or incidence of contingent work among this group. and individual and environmental factors associated with efficacious outcomes. Hence the purpose of our project, which is a field-initiated project funded by NIDLR to examine contingent employment of individuals with disabilities. In our project, which is a 3-year study, we first undertake qualitative research through narrative interviews to identify variables associated with practices and experiences. We also produce and test a survey that operationalizes key concepts. And then once we have produced and tested that survey, we intend to establish a preliminary evidence base on practices. And I think is a slightly different version of the slide deck that we had loaded up. So I'm going to leave it to Fran to take over.
What I wanted to talk about was the qualitative research interview. These research interviews are exploratory in nature. We're looking for the complexities of a person's experiences and their choices in non-traditional employment. These data can generate categories that can then be used to build self-reports that can be operationalized and used in large populations to generalize data. For this presentation, we're including approximately 20 to 60 to 90-minute interviews. We have at least 3 others, but they're currently being recoded, so they're not included in this analysis. All these interviews were taped and transcribed verbatim, and they were then entered into NVivo for content analysis. Our findings, we're presenting our findings as persona. There are so many individuals with unique experiences that in the interest of time, we created these composite characters representing the behaviors, needs, and goals and attitudes that were described in people's interviews. Okay, the first persona is David. David is a 45-year-old man who has a spinal cord injury resulting from a bicycle accident nearly 4 years ago. His passion is scuba diving, and repairing scuba equipment has always supplemented his main income, which was derived from various hotels and entertainment events in which he was a bartender. Since the accident, he's been unable to find full-time employment. However, he continues to work at the dive shop, repairing scuba equipment. He charges a flat rate for a specific repair and has an informal agreement to invoice the shop owner for a percentage of the fee. Before the accident, his income was approximately $50,000. Currently, he earns $15,000. Together with the SSDI and his savings, he's been able to comfortably, for the moment anyway, live. However, he's struggling with the numerous health and physical challenges of having an SCI and the problem of finding another form of full-time employment. Angela. Okay. Angela is a 24-year female. She was born with SMA, and she earns approximately $28,000 a year. She has always worked in contingent employment. She has a BA in English literature and earns approximately $28,000 a year. She freelances as a copy editor and reviewer for various online periodicals that are mostly concerned with disability issues. She works on a contract basis or a flat rate per review. She uses assistive technology, a power wheelchair, leg and wrist braces, drag and dictate, and she also relies on personal assistance from her mom in the mornings and evenings, but she hires a personal attendant when she has to travel between home and one of her jobs. She has recently gotten an internship in a theater that focuses on issues of inclusivity and diversity themes. This internship is to allow her to learn about managing and supporting theater operations. She has a strong social network. She lives with her family, she has a lot of friends, and through these networks, she has gained a lot of relationships with her supervisors, her employers, and her coworkers, and she continues to get work. She also volunteers to edit and review for these same online periodicals and websites, and she uses this expanding network to increase her employment opportunities. Okay. Jackie is a 45 African-American female who has been deaf since birth. She works as a secret shopper, which is someone who is hired by various companies and organizations to measure the quality of service or observe compliance with regulations or gather specific information about the products and or services. She's been doing this for many years. As an example, one of the many contracts she has is with a drug company. Her job is to periodically audit different doctors' offices in order to ensure that their samples are being dispensed appropriately. She has had lower paying jobs for health benefits, the first she's ever received. However, she views her primary work as the contract jobs, which she enjoys and has relied on for income for most of her working life. Although her income has varied over the years, she currently earns approximately $75,000 a year. Okay, Jimmy is a 56-year-old man, born in Brazil and adopted. He has spent most of his life in Kansas City. He is blind with no light perception since birth. He completed a bachelor's degree in communication, and he held numerous contract-based center jobs, first in debt collections and then telemarketing. Eventually, he worked for Gateway Computer and then Freedom Scientific, all of which were part-time contract work and done remotely. Based on his computer expertise and his knowledge of accessibility, he would also accept jobs to visit clients with blindness and low vision around the country to help them set up and use screen reading software. He also worked as a paid musician part-time to make ends meet, occasionally doing call-based work while on the road. Recently, because he was looking to settle down, he accepted a full-time permanent position as an assistive technology profession and relocated to another state. Okay.
All right. So those four personas are intended to perhaps give a flavor of the 22 interviews that are represented in this sample, but we could have very well have done any number of them. This slide, we brought it out in our other thing, but we want to maybe talk to some large trends. One common trend in many of the interviews that we conducted is the role of disability benefits in people's decisions whether or not to engage in this type of work. To give you an example, in one interview, for example, a respondent who had been for many years a successful accountant who had been in an automobile accident as a result of the spinal cord injury received, could no longer work full-time, then went to work as a tax preparer for a tax preparation firm. And as a result of that, you're probably aware, since we're in the middle of tax season, that work is seasonal, and he would work February, March, and April, so doing a lot of work for those 3 months. But he would have an agreement with the firm to actually pay him over the 12 months to ensure that he never went over his cap and lost benefits. So we would often hear stories like this.
Right, there was one nurse I know who worked part-time, and she was offered a 2-week position. She had had a brain tumor, she experienced pain and fatigue, and could not hold down a permanent full-time job. However, she was offered a contract work for about 2 weeks, and she was unable to take it because she said she would be working more, even though she would have enjoyed it, but earning less and would not have met the income caps for her SSDI.
So in addition to benefits, flexibility and life-work balance were often a common occurrence. So if you remember David, who is our man who had been a bartender and then went to work doing scuba equipment repair on a piece rate basis. One of the reasons he can't find a job is his need to constantly stretch and change positions from his standing manual wheelchair, and he has not been able to find a job that is well suited for his particular health needs. We often, in 2 cases, we interviewed mothers who had mitochondrial genetic disorders who themselves are raising children with the same disabilities. So while disability might be a reason, there's also simply the matter of being able to rear children and maintain life-work balance. The case of Angela, for example, points to the volunteering as a deliberate strategy that some people will have to create their own personal and professional networks for contingent employment. And we recognized in a lot of our interviews the differences that existed between people with congenital and acquired disabilities.
And Nate and Francis, I just got to ask you to make your last comment so we can move to the next one. So.
Okay. And so with all of that, we just simply want to thank you. And if you have any questions or a copy of this presentation, you may feel free to email either one of us. And of course, our FIP is graciously supported by NIDLR through ACL, and we definitely would like to acknowledge our funders, as well as our co-investigators, Maureen Linden and Salima LaForce at Georgia Tech. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we've got Meghan Henley who's going to talk to us a little bit about job quality. Now that we've seen some numbers on long-term employment trends from Andrew, and we have seen what I'll call the human face of employment from some of the qualitative interviews from Nathan and Francis. And, looking forward to the interviews now, or about the findings about job quality. So, Meghan.
Great, thank you. I'm excited to be part of this panel. I wanted to share some of the work that I've done with Deb Brucker on understanding the quality of jobs among people with a disability. Before I dive into the numbers, though, I wanted to actually start with an acknowledgement. Our work is funded by NIDLR, the EPM-RRTC, and we have actually worked on 3 different papers on the topic of job quality in the last year. All which were supported by this grant. So since I have a little bit of time to summarize 3 papers, I'm going to keep it very high level and give you sort of the main findings from each one. Let's see here. I wanted to start by talking about employment more broadly and thinking about what we know about employment as it relates to people with disabilities. So when we think about what it is we might want to know about employment, obviously, the first things that come up are the labor force participation rate, the employment to population ratio. These are things that are useful to get a sense of our starting point and what we're beginning with. And I don't think I'm going to be giving away any spoilers, even though we have a session next on NTIDE, but I did steal a recent infographic from there that shows the national trends in disability employment. And if you're not familiar with this shows basically the changes in the employment rate, labor force participation rate for people with disabilities. And while there are changes from month to month due to perhaps changes in the economy, what is consistent is that we see a very large difference between people with disabilities and people without. So others have and will talk about these numbers more, but I really just want to use this as a starting point for framing the results that I'm going to show. This shows along the top row for each of these, we see the numbers for people with disabilities, and the bottom row is those without. So what we see on the right side is the employment to population ratio. For those with a disability, that number is just 30.4%. And for those without, it's 74%. So what we really hope to do with this is to add to the research on employment patterns for people with disabilities. So beyond just looking at this rate, if we look at that 30.4%, those who do have a job, what do we know about the quality of their work? Among those with a disability who are employed, what is their work like? Are they underemployed? Are their wages comparable to those who don't have a disability? What about the work environment? Are people who work and have a disability just as happy with the work they're doing as those without? So our research question is looking at workers with disabilities. Are they just as likely to have good quality jobs as those who have no disability? So again, the numbers that I'm presenting here are focusing just on those who have jobs, the 30% of workers with a disability who do have a job. As I mentioned, I have 3 different papers in the works here. Each of those papers utilizes different data sources. Each one has different measures of disability and different measures of job quality. So, what is a good job? There are numerous measures, some of which can be pretty subjective. Luckily, we have some existing research that we draw very heavily from. So the European Job Quality Index uses these different dimensions to assess job quality. So the EU has researchers with a particular interest in this topic. Much of their work is utilized to be able to compare conditions for workers across different countries in Europe. So we adopt this approach in order to compare across different groups of workers. So in each of our 3 papers, we use different data sources, as I mentioned. Each are large-scale, nationally representative data sets that have different measures of job quality available. So the first paper that I'll summarize briefly looks at job quality with respect to pay and benefits. The second paper I'll summarize talks about the intrinsic quality of work. So this is getting at more subjective assessments of the work that people do on a day-to-day basis. The third paper includes a measure of benefits, but also has great measures on these remaining 3 items, looking at employment quality, workplace safety, work-life balance, something that Nathan and Fran mentioned. So just to kind of set this up, to keep it brief, I'll summarize what job quality measures I looked at for each paper and how people with and without disabilities compare to one another. So our first paper, we focused on pay and benefits as indicators of a good job. And we modeled this approach on existing research on job quality in the US that used this criteria. So a good quality job had to meet these 3 criteria. First, they had to have a job that offered employer-sponsored health insurance benefits. They had to have a job that paid higher than average wages. And thirdly, they had to have a job that offered some type of retirement contribution program. Further, if their job had none of these criteria met, they were considered a bad job. And if they met 1 or 2, but not all 3, we counted those as a fair job, following the work done by Jones and Schmidt. So, using data from the current population survey, which uses the 6-question sequence of assessing disability that includes cognition, ambulation, self-care, hearing, sight, and independent living. We found differences that were slight, and once we controlled for other characteristics, not statistically significant. So once we controlled for things like gender, race, and most notably, one thing that stuck out to us, which is related to this discussion, is self-reported health status. So those who said they had poor health were significantly less likely to have good jobs than other workers. But once we include that health measure, disability status was not a significant predictor of having a good quality job. Another important measure, obviously, was education, which would make sense because the measure of job quality we're using here is access to benefits and higher pay, above average pay. So people with higher education tend to have higher pay. But the main takeaway from this paper was that after controlling for health, disability status was not a significant predictor of job quality. Second paper. Looking at these intrinsic characteristics of work. So these are things like skill. For instance, we asked, the survey that we looked at asked, is your work related to your highest degree? For autonomy, are you satisfied with the degree of independence you have at work? Similarly, for powerfulness, are you satisfied with the level of responsibility you have at work? For meaningfulness, about your work's contribution to society, and for self-fulfillment, are you satisfied with the level of intellectual challenge you have at work? So in order to be counted as having a good quality job, a worker would have had to say that they were very satisfied or somewhat satisfied to all 5 of these measures. And also I want to highlight here, this particular study looked just at workers with at least a college degree. So this is data from the National Survey of College Graduates. Since in the first paper, obviously, we found that education was a factor in predicting job quality, as we might expect. We dug into this paper looking just at college graduates. What we found here, looking Even after controlling for characteristics that are related to employment in the literature, things like gender, race, highest degree, so everyone had at least a bachelor's degree, but even higher levels of education, we controlled for that. Whether or not someone had supervisory responsibilities at work, the field that they worked in. What we found, even after controlling for these other components, were that college-educated workers were 27% less likely to have a good job using these criteria if they had a disability. Now switching to our third paper. This one included 6 dimensions of employment quality. So we had the General Social Survey had a module on quality of work life, and so we borrowed from whatever measures they had that were available, which were numerous. So for each of these dimensions, there was 1 to 2 indicators that we used to count for employment quality. So for instance, fringe benefits is actually a qualitative assessment. The worker had to indicate whether or not they agreed with the statement that their fringe benefits were good. For job security, we also asked them to assess whether they thought their job security was good, but we also looked to see if they had a permanent or a temporary job. And they had to have agreed with both statements, that they agreed the job security was good and that their job was not a temporary job. Similarly, workplace safety, there were statements on that. Work-life balance asked about interference with family life as well as stress at work. Work support asked about whether they agreed that they were treated with respect at work, whether they agreed that their supervisor was concerned with their welfare. And finally, workplace autonomy looked at agreement with the statement that they had freedom to decide how to do their job. So lots of measures here. And in order to count that they had a good job, they had to have had each of those dimensions met. So again, this is GSS data. The disability measure is a bit different on this survey, just because we're using what's available. So we measured disability as having an activity limitation due to health 3 or more days in the last month. So those who met that criteria are counted here in blue as having a disability. And just 14% of full-time workers, after adjusting for other characteristics such as age, race, gender, and education, had a good, what we counted as a good quality job using this criteria, compared to 22% with no disability. Now, I do want to mention that most full-time workers do report that they had job security, good fringe benefits, safe workplaces, work support, workplace autonomy. The real kind of deal breaker in this measure was the work-life balance dimension. And that ended up bringing the percent with good jobs substantially down. So I want to offer a couple little takeaways from these 3 papers. First, just thinking about, we want to think about employment trends in a variety of ways. If we want to talk about employment, we should really try to dive deeper into the experiences of workers and think about what their daily work life is like. I think this relates to what Dave said at the opening, and I think that this research actually pairs nicely with what Nathan and Fran showed. But if we're looking at something like job quality, another thing to consider is that there are different ways to assess job quality. And so I think it would be wonderful if we had a single data source that had both a measure of disability and had everything on the job quality index, the European job quality index. If we had a single data source that had all of that we could use, that would be wonderful. But we're limited to what we have, and so we've kind of created different papers that looked at each of the dimensions that were available in many large-scale data sources. So our primary findings, so for some of our measures, workers with a disability have substantially lower rates of job quality than those with no disability. The overall rates varied from paper to paper, as you noticed. But I think what we should consider now is why this might be the case. So I think that some of the qualitative work that was presented earlier is really informative in In this case, it may be that workers with a disability are faced with making trade-offs where they value some aspect of work life over more so than others. So it may be that certain aspects of job quality, like work-life balance, as they mentioned, rank much more higher, and so their workers with a disability may be more likely to make a trade-off on some of these other dimensions of job quality that I talked about. So just something to consider is the fact that different types of people with different types of disabilities also may value certain aspects of job quality more than others as well. That's all I've had. Great.
Thank you very much to our panel. We have 10 minutes. I was about to say 12. 10 minutes for questions and answers. I know I have some questions, but I want to make sure we get to the audience first. And even before we do that, let me check to see if there are questions online by chance. Is there any questions online? Not yet. Okay. So if you're online and you're listening, this is a behavioral nudge. Think of a question and we will get you airtime.
Give you a $100 Monopoly bill. Signed by Dave Wittenberg.
Dave?
Yep. So, yeah, this is for Nathan and Francis. I know the Social Security Administration has had a lot of interest in how contingent employment has been affecting beneficiaries and applicants, et cetera. But I think what you're pointing out is the potential for disability policy, and particularly the SSDI program, to drive contingent employment, right? That there are, you gave examples of beneficiaries who are contingently employed because if they were regularly employed, they would lose their benefits. Is that fair? And,
Yes, that's fair.
And also, have you thought about that with respect to, did you come across instances involving other public policies? And I'm thinking in particular of the Americans with Disability Act and, lots of concerns, some evidence at the time when it was first passed that employers were avoiding hiring people with disabilities because of the, accommodation requirements or fears of lawsuits if they wanted to let them go. And I have heard from labor economists about, one reason that employers use temp agencies to hire people temporarily is to basically assess those people to see whether the people they want to hire permanently. And you can imagine assessing people for invisible disabilities or might be one thing that's on their minds. But I'm just wondering if you've come across any evidence of that.
I think we've come across people who use recruiters. And yes, I believe that the recruiters are the first level of assessing whether or not a person is qualified for the job. It is the supervisors, however, who come through the recruitment who really decide how well the person will work. And it's with these people that we find that employers and supervisors, employees and supervisors and employers and coworkers often form a very strong relationship because the work is temp, and as they get a reputation for doing the job well, they're increasingly rehired and the social network expands, which leads to other job opportunities.
Right. So at this juncture, it's, we've got all of our interviews to draw upon, so we're still yet to the point where we would make what I would call generalizable findings, but I can see it flowing the other way as well, though. I interviewed one respondent who told me that she deliberately chose to work in contingent employment because she just really did not care for having to request accommodations in the workplace, and that she had adversarial relationships with some of her employers because of her nature of her disability, a very complex genetic condition. She just found it more advantageous for her to simply sidestep it and just create her own sort of networks rather than, even though she did for a while have a permanent job. She left the work, she withdrew from the workforce, and it didn't always have to do with a loss of SSDI in her case. So we see a wide array of experiences, and beginning to sort of maybe try to understand, to go beyond that and get some generalizable findings, I think might be able to better answer some of your questions. One of the ambitions of our project, though, is to hopefully inform policy, although I will say that sometimes I've heard things from interview respondents about how, none of mine have admitted to breaking the law. They all do W-9s, they're all on time, they've all said so. But at the same time, I wonder if some of the research might actually result in policies that might run counter to some of the things that we're sort of striving for in terms of employment.
Question in back.
Hi, this is Aimee Mullins. I'm with the University of Colorado, and I have a question for Andrew. With regard to the Social Security applicants data that you were showing, are you able to pull data or suss out descriptors such as age, industry, and reason for departure from the workforce?
Not from that data source. Years ago, I tried to do that with the CPS. The CPS follows people. And it's been used for some job loss. Actually, Sophia Mitra Deb's colleague has done that. Whether she's merged her disability work into that, I don't know. But not from my data source, but that's an interesting question of reason for exit. Yeah.
Question from Annette B. online. She asks, when talking about contingent employment and using it as a way of controlling income so as not to lose benefits, are you talking about losing the SSDI, SSI benefits or losing Medicare or Medicaid? They both have income caps, but the caps are different.
Most of the people identify SSDI and SSI as the benefits that they're most concerned about losing.
That's usually where most discussions go to. It has not been typically so much on Medicare and Medicaid in our interviews.
Yeah, I've heard that Medicaid is a bit more difficult because it's monthly rather than quarterly, and I have friends that are PhD economists and can't manage their daughter's Medicaid, their older daughter's Medicaid, because they keep tripping into it. Just as a question while I have the mic, for contingent work, a lot of the gig economy requires assets such as a car, or for Airbnb, you have to have a house or a room. For a lot of things, you have to have the latest software, high internet connection, video ability. Do you find in any of your research that maintaining those level of approach, because you have to have a good car to drive over to, and do you find that assets are an issue? Because that could be one way of supporting contingent work, is to provide asset support through VR or something like that.
I had an ambition when we started this project that we would be interviewing Uber drivers and Lyft drivers, and this is who we would be engaging, and I was a little shocked that that's where these are not the sorts of people we had interviewed. That being said, we've purposely withheld a certain number of interviews because I intend to do targeted recruitment to actually interview these people and ask specifically on these things. So we've held out 5 to 10 interviews that we have yet to conduct that we're specifically going to target for these questions, because they are vitally important for us to know answers to.
My question was for Andrew. I was wondering what you were thinking might be the causes of the recent uptake in labor force participation.
Yeah.
2 things came to mind. One was this is a period where automation in many jobs is starting to kick in, and whether there was evidence that may have made things easier. And the other one was how much evidence was there that this might be on the employer side? So you've been talking about employers being hesitant to, but they're thinking about making employment decisions carefully if they're not wanting to commit necessarily to all the accommodations. If employers are more willing to hire, or they're more willing to go further in accommodation, because there's, some people would argue we've gone past full employment, and the labor market is looks very unique in terms of such high demand for labor.
Yeah, so Dave Wittenberg scribbled down the same question for me, and I don't have any answers yet. I do have some of the same hypotheses to look, to investigate. Probably the first thing that I want to look at is local retail. Now, I don't have a local measure, and with the CPS, we don't have something as low as Pumas to be able to identify the specific locations where people are. So that may be limited, but my sense has always been that it's likely local retail that might be driving it, because that's where when you see vacancies, that's where you see them. And so to look at the vacancy rates to see if it is demand that's driving it rather than supply. It is still, you have to make a match between employer and employee, and I've often thought that, and the reason I think local is because transportation is viewed as a big barrier, whether they don't have the assets of having a car, or they don't have necessarily the ability to drive long distances, or have, accommodated transportation. That local would be where it's at, that once I start seeing things local, I'm able to go. And I also want to look at whether this is just a part-time. Is this just part-time that's rising? It has been drying off. The last few months have been not as good as previously. So I'm not quite sure why that would be either. But
Okay. All right. I was going to have a question for you guys, but I'll ask you.
Oh, keep going.
No, I want to keep on time for the next panel, which is 11:30. And as we transition to that panel, we do not have a break. Is that right? We're just going right into the next panel. What's that?
Correct. No
Correct.
break. We'd like to invite John O'Neill and Elaine Patz to the stage.
Yep.
We'll
So
continue.
John and Elaine, if you
Don
could.
Elaine, please make your way to the front.
And as we do this, I think one of the parting shots that I do have for this panel is there's a lot of optimistic data coming out of this. We've got increasing employment trends, and we've got some pretty creative entrepreneurial stuff going on with people with disabilities finding work. I think these are important things to keep in mind as we move into the third and fourth panels today, as we think about these new interventions to support people with disabilities and kind of what is potentially working about these things. And I just wanted to plant that in the audience's mind as we first listen to End Time, which I think is going to provide even more context on the employment rights.